Why shouldn't people who are considered neurodivergent not have the same protections and opportunities that everyone else has? And that's a really, really important question, and you'll understand why as we move on. But before we get too far into this, because I'm getting super excited, let's talk about who is considered neurodivergent. So people who have ADHD, Down syndrome, dyscalculia, which is difficulty with math, dyslexia, difficulty with reading, intellectual disabilities, autism, bipolar disorder, sensory processing disorders, Tourette syndrome, certain forms of social anxiety. These people are considered neurodivergent. Now, as I was preparing for this lecture, one of the things that I found was a discrepancy on who should be considered neurodivergent. And a really awesome and interesting question that was posed to the reader, right? It was a researcher writing this, and the researcher posed this question to themselves and to the reader. And the question was, do you have to be born neurodivergent? And the researcher was asking this question because the researcher considered themselves neurodivergent because the researcher had autism. But the researcher also had PTSD from an experience that happened later on in life. And the researcher acknowledged that that PTSD, although he was not born with it, it definitely impacted his neurological functioning. It definitely impacted the way he perceived and behaved in the world. And so the researcher was wondering, does someone with autism have more claim to the neurodivergent term than someone with PTSD? This is a really big question, and I want you to think about that, and you might not have an answer, right? This is a really tough question to answer, but it's worthy of thinking about because we have kids in our schools who may not fit the disorder, right? Who may not be born with it, but have the symptoms and the experiences. Are those kids still worthy of the protections even though they don't have the label? That's a really important question, right? Who gets into this group? Now, the concern is, right, from other researchers who say, yeah, I hear what you're saying, right? I get you, right? But if we let everybody in the group, right, then it's no longer neurodivergent, then everybody is in the group. Everybody is considered neurodivergent. And then isn't that a problem, right? Then doesn't that water down the point that we're trying to make? And then doesn't that in a way make people who are born with autism or different intellectual issues or social anxiety, people who have these issues that are considered mental disorders, doesn't that in some way erode the protections that this term potentially could offer them? So I don't have the answer to that question. One of the things that frustrates my students the most is that I ask a lot of questions and I offer very little answers. My job as the teacher is not to give you the answers. My job is to help you think so that you can come up with the answers yourself, and to think about your classroom or the children that you serve or the children that you work with, and think about who falls into this neurodivergent category, right? Either by birth or by circumstance. How are they categorized? How are they thought about? How are they treated? What do you think their experience is? When you read the stories, and a little bit later on in the sexuality section, we will go through a blogger story who identifies as a queer neurodivergent individual. And this person talks about how unseen and how vulnerable they feel, right? And how our social institutions, how our rules, how our policies contribute to that fact. And so us as educators, and now I'm including myself in this analysis, we have to think about, how do we set up our classrooms? How do we get to know our students? What information is important for us as we think about the curriculum that we teach, the way that we assess, right? If we understand that we have a neurodiverse group of people in our classrooms, then shouldn't our curriculum match that? right? Shouldn't it? And I'm thinking of myself as a teacher. Of all my years in the classroom, over 15 years in the classroom, and how little thought I put to neurodiversity and how hard that might have made it for my students. And then thinking about the students who came in who were very open with me and like, look, Dr. Bennefield, I got this, and this going on. It's going to make it harder for me to learn X, Y, and Z, and how I had to make those accommodations, and sort of the burden we put on students to advocate for themselves, and thinking about the sort of gendered and race and socioeconomic intersections that may stop a student from being able to adequately advocate for themselves. And that perhaps we shouldn't be putting kids in those positions. And if we put 19-year-olds, right, I teach the big babies, my college kids. If we put the late adolescents and adults in those positions, what about our K through 12 kids who might not even have the language to advocate for themselves? What becomes our responsibility as educators? And if you are a parent, right, if you're not an educator, but you're watching this because you've got a kid, I teach a lot of aunts and uncles. It's weird. My last time teaching, I was teaching all of these. I was teaching a course for educators. No educator took it. And I asked the people in the class, like, well, who are you people? Like, why are you here? And they were all concerned aunts and uncles. It was so bizarre. They were like, these are not my kids, but my sister is them up. Excuse me. Language, but that's the energy that they brought to the class. It was really funny. It was really interesting. And so they were trying to figure out, how do they learn more about their niece or nephew so that they could be a better advocate for them. So even if you're not in the classroom, how do you advocate for your child? How do you teach someone, right? A teacher who may have never heard about this, who may not understand, and they've got your loved one, your baby loved one in the class, and you're trying to figure out, how do I communicate with this teacher so that they understand that this child, my niece, perceives the world differently and needs certain accommodations, but there's nothing wrong with my niece or my nephew. My niece is just showing a different way in which the brain processes. It's fascinating. It's phenomenal. Right? It's